Hello, my name is Chandramouli Gopalakrishnan. I work as a principal product manager at Microsoft. I handle a couple of streams of Microsoft Outlook. And today I'm here to talk about product management in small companies, medium-sized growth scale companies, and finally in large mega corporations like Microsoft. I would be talking about my experiences and what I have faced and what I have experienced. This should hopefully give an idea for folks who are aspiring product managers or working in product managers on the different types of experiences and the different expectations in B2B, B2C, in small startups, and in large corporations like Microsoft. Before we get into the nitty-gritties of all of this, let me give you my story. It's an accidental story, accidental entry to the scene, as I call it. I did my grad school in the US in a field far away from all of this stuff that I do right now. Did my research in a field called electronic design automation, where we wrote software for chip designers to synthesize low-power electronic devices. Far away from Microsoft Outlook and product management. In fact, as far as away as it could get. I worked about 10 years in that industry, leading various sized engineering teams, primarily doing engineering management and engineering IC work. I did have a small stint in Microsoft about 10, 12 years ago for a couple of years, but let's keep that aside for a bit. That didn't really fit my bill, and I went back to that industry for another 3 years. The key accidental entry came in when about 8 years ago, I was coming back from office and I got a call from this company named GoIbibo. It was actually the founder and CEO calling me. He had written a couple of blog posts of mine. I had been writing a blog for right now I've been writing for about 17 years or so. He had read a few of my articles on standardized budget accommodations in India, and this was way before it was actually mainstream. I didn't even know that it was an interview. Had talked about this for like multiple conversations, ranging hours actually. And I thought it was just somebody who was reading my blog, and it was interesting to talk to somebody who read my blog. A couple of weeks later, I was offered a position in product management at GoIbibo. This was a leap of faith from the company and from myself, I would say, jumping from something which was my comfort zone to outside. And I learned product management from scratch, right? This was essentially doing what I love, doing what I wrote about in real life, and what better you could ask for. And I've never looked back after that. It's been about 8, 9, almost 10 years I've been into product management, did a large number of startups, all travel-related startups, and then now into Microsoft. We'll talk about 3 kinds of stories, right? One is about a high-growth, fast-paced B2C startup, which was GoIbibo. We'll talk about that a little detailed and what I did over there and what PMs encounter in these kind of setups. We'll talk about a very early stage B2B2C startup, and we'll talk a little more about that. This was a startup which I almost founded, and this was as an incubation program from Mexico, but this was like a 0 to 1. We didn't have anything to a paying customer, and we'll talk about what product management is in these kind of setups, and finally in large corporations like Microsoft. GoIbibo, for those who are not based out of India, is essentially one of the largest, rather was one of the largest travel portals, online travel portals in India, kind of like Expedia and Travelocity in the US, if you will, and Bookings.com in Europe and everywhere else. Very high growth. I was there at the point in time when we were inflecting like almost a hockey stick growth at that time, both in airlines and in hotels, and experimenting on everything travel. We'll talk about what we did during those times. We're going to be talking about experiments primarily, and this was the backbone of almost everything that we did at GoIbibo. We did experiments to find out what conversion funnels changed, We did experiments to figure out which kind of buttons work. We did experiments on the order of the search results page. We did like changing the order of the columns, showing the prices with and without taxes, all kinds of experiments. And you could see the wonderful way by which the conversion funnels changed when you did these experiments. It was a high growth startup. So this was where the fuel was. We basically went and did anything and everything that could squeeze growth as much as possible. The second thing that leads from this is data is king. From all of these experiments and every user conversion that is there on the pages, right? Data is captured. We did a weekly data analysis. This was like a funnel analysis from top to bottom. We overemphasized on drop-offs. We went and took a look at every possible way by which users dropped off the funnel. We just went in all out with respect to attributions. How did users come and land in this funnel? How are they reacting? How did the funnel actually eventually translate to? All of that. And the third thing that I'd like to segue into is the network effects. Network effects is the way by which you eventually create a virtuous funnel, virtuous cycle, so to speak, wherein like the growth that you do by means of, in our case, a referral program. We introduced something called Go Cash, which is basically getting cash points, Go IBBO points for every rupee that you spent on the travel portal. The network effect kicks in when you get rewarded immaterial. You get rewarded for introducing the program to as many people as possible. We hooked into the contacts page. We hooked into Android's contact list. You could actually go and say, I'm giving you 50 Go Cash points to everybody in my contacts page. It just went viral. And folks were spending on Go IBBO primarily because they had points, right? And that's the virtuous cycle that kicks in. To the point where like there were people starting to scam the system, right? Getting co-cash from others, gifted from others. We had to put in limits. We had to put in limits to a point where the real consumers of Go Cash weren't penalized. These are great problems to solve for a product manager because these are high stakes, but at the same time, data and experimentation can solve a multiple of these. Every day we went in with hypotheses, we went and validated these hypotheses, we went in and actually go and figured what would change the game over here. The next three things are kind of tactical that I want to talk to you about. Stakeholder management or stakeholder alignment is one of those, right? In these kind of high growth startups, PMs truly are the glue, right? I mean, you got to go and convince your sales folks on where they need to be pumping the effort on. We need to get the designers and the PMs in charge. We need the developers to be developing in sync with the designers, front-end engineers and back-end engineers, and then go very closely into the support cycle. Talk to people who are manning the support lines, see what are the maximum pain lines that are established. All of these things, I mean, the PM is pretty much at the center of all of these because at a high growth startup, everybody's got their goals. Like support engineers have their goals, front-end engineers have their goals. Everybody has an extremely high goals too. I mean, and it requires somebody to pull them all together for the greater good of the company. That's super, super useful. Very soon you come to a point where like your growth is starting to pay off and you start getting, your funnel is big, you got people landing on your pages. Now is the time you need to convert. And that's the next big thing, right? Reduce user friction. We used to go and do the thing like, somebody's actually gone and landed on your search result page. How quickly can you get them to pay, right? Default selections, pulling in your name and addresses from store locations, getting people to sign in so that like you can finish your checkout and as quickly as possible. The whole shebang, right? I mean, this is important in almost every other industry, but in this case, it's even more important because you've spent a lot in getting your traffic in. You better convert. And of course, exceptions are there. There were content PMs in Go IBBO who had exactly the opposite targets, right? Engagement. People landing on the SEO pages should be engaged. They shouldn't go out. How many hours do they spend on that? How many times they come back to the same page again and again and again, and so they can convert. It's all fun. I mean, trying to get the maximum impact out of this. The last thing I want to talk about is these are the companies where you can actually go and start specializing. You can have growth PMs do their best over here. You can have content PMs who actually do wonderful work creating content. You could have specific transaction payment PMs. We had all of these at GoIVGo, and people were just going bonkers with it. They were going deep and actually, getting extreme technical expertise. You don't get these opportunities in too many areas. I mean, you've got traffic, you got volume, you got funding, you got growth. You basically go and deliver and get specialization. The next class of startups that I want to talk about is the next story, if I can say so, is an early stage startup, B2B2C SaaS. And to give you a little more context on this, we started to build a B2B SaaS solution for the aviation industry. So we wanted to do what you would probably call a Shopify for airlines. So you actually got your entire e-commerce set up as a SaaS platform so that you can go and drop it onto any airline, and you will get the airline.com website, mobile site, Android, iOS, everything in one shot. Right? We did this. We had one paying customer. We had a few more in the pipeline, and we were basically going and creating this from scratch. Nobody really had this in the world, right? 0 to 1. As in, we got the engineers hired. They wrote the first lines of code. How does a product manager's job? What are the opportunities and what's the expectation in these cases? One of the key things over here is the relationship between product management and business in these kind of situations. This is no longer a case of, hey, you do something and you talk to business and they will deliver the goods, right? As opposed to high growth startups and established startups where it's more of a stakeholder management game. In the case of early stage startups, PMs need to get plugged in literally to business to a point where to get your first handful of customers, the PM must actually deliver everything and anything needed for business to succeed. Because until a certain point in time, before you get into growth stage, you're still in existential crisis, right? I mean, you need your company to first succeed to exist, and then you can go into growth. Beyond that, essentially, it's just relentless execution. You need to execute and do whatever it takes to essentially make sure that what you promise to business, what you promise to your customers need to be done. You can think all the strategy you want, but in this case, it's existential. You need to execute. You need to execute as much as possible to deliver on the goods. If possible, even earlier than promised deadlines. But at some point in time, you even figure there are no deadlines. It is just you need to deliver and deliver and deliver more than what is expected, because that's how you gain trust. Especially in SaaS products and platforms, trust is what it gets. You deliver more than what is expected as a base level. That's as much credibility that you get. Finally, one of the things in this group of PM expectations is the PM part in engineering foundations. This is super important because some of the very early platform architectures, if you will, are purely based on the direction in which the product is evolving. I'll give you an example. When we were building the SaaS platform for airlines, there is this component for handling what are called SSRs, which is basically a fancy word or an acronym for the ancillaries, your food and seat and extra baggage that you will basically add on to an airline ticket. We could have gone with just a base 3-category SSR system, but then we knew that this was going to be a SaaS platform, and we're going to be rolling it out to multiple airlines. With that in mind, we had to have a configurable SSR engine, a full-on engine. Sure, it took us 3 to 4 more months than what it should have taken. It was complex, very complex, but that's an engineering decision that is decided based on product evolution. You need to know at some point in time as to how much you spend on your engineering foundations. Well, this is absolutely required in this case because you didn't have code before. If you had code, you would have decided that it's basically an easier decision, but then you're writing it for the first time. So your engineers and your architects and your senior engineers are looking at you saying, should I not, right? Sure, mistakes happen, but a lot of times this is a very close, delicate dance that you need to do with engineering and business and basically figure out what we need to do. The other thing that I like to talk about in a very early stage startups is what I fondly call optimized delight. User delight is an often used term in product management. You have to delight your users, right? While that's a given when you're talking about high growth and established startups and probably with respect to large corporations, when you are in a point where like you're trying to establish your existential identity, you need to first get your users right. You can delight them, but then you need to get your base stories as much as possible done. If you don't get your base stories done, you can't delight them. And sometimes you got to stop just short of delighting, but that's okay. I mean, that's something that you got to live with and plan for delighting them as you go forward. These are trade-offs that you have to make. These are very hard trade-offs. If you're very used to delighting users, these are hard problems to solve. The other thing that I usually talk about very closely related to stakeholder management is the extreme sport of firefighting in a startup. These are things like when the CMO of the airline in which you have deployed your platform calls you up at 6 a.m. and says, hey, your QR code curbside check-in isn't working. What do? That's firefighting. You got to go wake up your engineers, you got to wake up almost everybody, get them to debug, look at your logs. This is something that is a part and parcel of early stage startup life because you're a small company. You got to do what it takes to get this to succeed. This is extremely stressful at the time of happening, but the amount of learnings that you get from firefighting is unparalleled. Right? I mean, you would essentially, going back to the configurable parameters that I said in the SSR engine, the next time you architect something, I bet you will have your engineers making sure every possible logs, every possible ways by which danger can be averted and alerts are done will be there. It all takes one firefighting to essentially make sure things get way more robust as you go forward. Finally, a PM at some point in time, when you're asking them what they do in an early stage startup, the answer usually is whatever it needs, whatever it takes. Right? Do what you need to do. Engineers know what they need to do. Designers know what they need to do. Sales, business, customer support, the CXOs, everybody knows what they need to do. But are they all doing it for the common cause? Pretty much that's the PM's job. And after all of this, it still comes to a point where like the PM still needs to go work with the founders to help them fundraise and do a lot more. But at the end of the day, it is whatever it takes, right? That is something that I personally would take as the largest learning from all of my startup experiences. And finally, we'll come to megacorps. So it's been a couple of years since I've been in Microsoft. I did spend a couple of years, about 11 years ago, but we'll talk about some of the change in expectations, but equally fun things that we do as PMs in large corporations. The first thing that comes to mind, and when people come ask me, in fact, as late as yesterday morning, when I was having breakfast with a friend, is, don't you find there are too many processes in large companies? That's the first ever question that anybody asks, because typically you would just go and ship something in startups. but you just can't go and ship something in Microsoft. My response to that is, how many types of people, what's the scale of folks or users that your startup typically has? Sure, a good day might have like early stage or a medium stage might have 1 million users, active users. But if you look at maybe a product like Outlook, that's way more number of people who are using Outlook, number one. And it's just not English. You got people using this in Japan. You got people using this in UAE. You got people using it in Mandarin. You got folks writing out of Exchange servers on-premise. You got people using Outlook to sync their Gmail into their client. I don't know how many of you even know that, but you can do a gazillion things with Outlook. And the expectation is it should work exactly the same way as everybody else. A compose experience in Japanese should be exactly similar and user-friendly as a compose experience in Mandarin or in English or in UAE, right? It's got to be exactly the same. Localization has to be done. Strings need to be taken care of. Security and privacy, compliances have to be taken care of. There are so many things that need to be taken care of for the scale at which it's used. The next thing I want to talk about is communication. Communication in large corporations can actually be scary. It's scary because there are sometimes you don't even know whom you're communicating to. You do get the art as you move forward, but at some point in time, your communication needs to be crisp, clear, articulate, and at the same time communicating as much as you need to. That is what makes it scary, because there are folks who would require you to be as crisp as possible. The same audience, there will be people who will require all the details. And the same audience will basically say, come and explain to me in another meeting, right? So it's got to have all of what needs to be done in an email. And this is not just for emails. Emails, documents, specifications that you write, specs that you write, presentations that you go to. It's incredibly important that communication is bang on, because how well you communicate is how quickly you can get people to align in a large company like Microsoft or Google or wherever you go to. Your network matters. Typically, people would think network matters only in startups and places like that, but not necessarily. There are pockets and groups and circles of influence, if you will, in large companies, and the larger your network is, the faster that you can get things done. I'll give you an example. I'm working on something called Outlook Groups, and we're working on something where we need to actually have an overlap with something called security and compliance. And with that, we went and spoke to a customer, and the customer essentially is actually using both. They're using encrypted emails and they're using Outlook Groups. And both of them have a problem. And the easiest way to solve them is get everybody into a room. And unless you had the network together, that would have costed me another couple of months to get everybody into the room. Several other examples abound, but essentially your network matters in a large company. I mean, to the point where as you grow in the hierarchy in a large company, in product management, it comes to a point where like number of people who know you and your work and your impact basically matters a lot in how quickly and how efficiently you get work done in a large company. The other large thing that I want to talk about is large-scale experimentation, right? We spoke about experimentation in a high-growth setup like GoIBO. How is it different from a large company? The number of users that you get in a large company is like 100x, 1000x more than what you get even in a high-growth startup. In this case, you can actually take decisions based on the data and the experiments that you do. It's got to be more formal. It takes a lot of effort to actually get to experimentation methodologies in large companies. But in some agile products in large companies, you can actually do a lot of large-scale experimentation. The good thing about large-scale experimentation is it's not just small tweaks like in high-growth startups. This can influence the actual course of a product. Would people using this large product of Microsoft ever be interested in a certain feature? Yes or no? I mean, that could actually be defined by a large-scale experiment. And this could actually result in sub-teams be created and feature streams created and all of that. So that's the incredible power of the large user base that you have in large corporations. We spoke about stakeholder alignment and management. In the case of large companies, it's slightly different. It no longer is stakeholder management. It's not. It's literally not. It's more of a stakeholder alignment, because essentially everybody actually has their agendas, all of them to the greater good of the company, but they need not always be aligned towards the greater good of that project. So what you need to do is get everybody aligned to a point where like the ROI and the impact of that project is all aligned, because that's the only way that the project will ever succeed. Large companies like Microsoft focus a lot on the impact that is delivered, and for that you need the alignment of not just key individuals, right? Multiple groups for that matter. In Microsoft, there are several libraries and user components that are shared among multiple products. You could actually see that. You could see similarities in your Outlook Compose pane and what you do at Microsoft Word. You could see similarities on the ribbons. You can see similarities in the print dialog. I mean, there are so many things that are actually shared components in large companies, and getting people and teams and charters aligned is a huge thing that product managers in large companies can actually give their impact on. The last thing in large companies, which is very, very satisfying, so to speak, personally, is the user impact. And most folks would have heard Satya Nadella's earnings call speeches, or like in other events. One of the things that we keep overemphasizing again and again is our mission. I mean, it's so ingrained into all of us about improving the productivity of every individual on this planet. You could actually go and work on any product in the company and actually relate it to how it is impacting a user. And when you actually see how it's impacting a user, that's when it kicks in that what you're working is really, really impactful. When you go and talk to a user who's using Outlook day in and day out to, let's say, vet financial documents in an encrypted manner in a financial institution, you're looking at somebody whose entire job runs on a tool that is being developed or improved by you. These are spectacular things that give you immense gratification of what you do as your job and your projects. How is it impacting people? I mean, it's immensely grateful, and it's a good feeling. And that's kind of where I'm going to end the final point on working for large mega corporations. The immense user satisfaction and user impact that you get. Finally, in closing, there are a few things that I wanted to talk about. Immaterial of which kind of product companies that you're part of, there are a couple of things that is always expected out of you, and that is what is going to make you shine through and through. The first is impact, impact, impact. I mean, that's the biggest mantra that you should all overemphasize on. Typically, impact can be shown in various ways: customer satisfaction, higher sales, conversion improvements, whatever it is, right? Engagement scores, but impact, over-index on impact, and that's kind of the way to go. Play to your strengths. There are more and more companies where we are actually looking at content PMs, we're looking at growth PMs, we're looking at customer service PMs, we're looking at so many different types of specializations of PMs. And if you're a product manager, and you should go just play to your strengths, because a PM's job typically is you need to go have fun and basically play to your strengths so that you can basically go and do your best job ever. Finally, you should have fun. And if you don't have fun, PM's job is actually very, very, very stressful. It is not as deterministic as most other professions are, especially in the startups and engineering worlds. It is very hazy, ambiguous, stressful times. But then, if you are into it and if you have fun, loads and loads of fun, this essentially just makes it so much more easier and so much more fun. Thank you so much for listening to this talk.